Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second part of our Chapter 33 lecture. Let's just get right to it. We're going to, last time we set up the agri-demand to agri-supply model, and now we're going to use it. And I'm going to show 4 classic examples of movements in economic activity that we analyze using the agri-demand agri-supply model. And I think you'll be able to take these 4 examples and use them to apply that model broadly to understand most any economic fluctuation that we see. It's a very useful, very widely applicable model. Go to the notepad. We're going to start off, well, first and foremost, again, we're doing Y in the price level. That's the foundation of the agri-demand agri-supply model. We'll start here at agri-demand 1, and here's our agri-supply curve. So we'll start with a classic example, the Great Depression. The Great Depression. Here is our initial level of output, Y1. We start off here at point A. And we can assume that we are initially at the long-run equilibrium. We can assume that Y1 is the same thing as the natural rate of output, Y bar. That's not crucial to this point, but it's still fine to assume that. Anyway, here's agri-demand 1. This is October, let's just say this is October 1st, 1929. October 1st, 1929. So what happens first and foremost? Well, we experienced a tremendous stock bubble in the 1920s. The story that we told about the stock bubble in the 1990s is very similar to what happened in the 1920s. I'm not going to go into it for the sake of brevity because, this video could be so long because there's so many things that we could say. But the stock bubble of the 20s had a lot of kind of eerie, in some ways, similarities to the stock bubble of the 1990s. It was a time of great technological progress. The U.S. economy was growing so rapidly and so healthily due to technological progress and due to increasing prominence in the world after World War I. Stock prices were rising for legitimate reasons. Over the course of a few years, people saw that, people got excited, people wanted to get in on it. We started to see a demand-driven market. People started to buy stocks because of this enthusiasm, this excitement. Next thing we knew, by the end of the decade, it was clear that a bubble had emerged. So I don't remember the exact date, but at some point in October of 1929, the stock market crashes, the bubble bursts. People realize stocks are overpriced. There were a whole bunch of other problems in the financial system as well due to a lack of regulation and due to fraud and due to other very dirty things that had emerged. The original Ponzi scheme occurred during this time. Anyway, people realized that stock prices had gotten way out of hand and the stock market crashed. The crash in the stock market drives down agri-demand like that. Okay, crash in the stock market drives down agri-demand like that. People just don't have as much money as they had before. You think you have $1,000 in stocks, you look at your portfolio and now you have $700, you cut back on your spending as a result. We move from point A to point B and we see output has fallen, the economy has fallen into a recession. Price level has fallen as well. Of course, here's the initial price level, and now the price level started to fall further. The economy's in recession. Next thing we know, we see that a lot of banks are starting to become insolvent, partly as a result of this recession and partly because of other factors. We see that people are starting to, well, no. Hold on. Second thing, we come along in 1930 or 1931, and the government decides to raise taxes. We have a big increase in tariffs in the early 30s in response to this recession that has emerged. Tax increases, as we know, further reduce agri demand. That puts us down here at point C. that further drives down economic activity. Here's point C. That's called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. Smoot-Hawley, tariffs are taxes. So, the big increase in tariffs, that's essentially an increase in taxes. And as we discussed last chapter, an increase in taxes lowers aggregate demand. Anyway, now to where I was. Sorry, I forgot that one little tidbit. Next thing, we start to see that a lot of banks start to get in trouble. This recession that we're in the midst of now, in the early 30s, it's still a recession at this point, by the way, right? A depression is a bad recession. We've only had one depression, and we just kind of made up that term to mean a really bad recession. But it was still a recession at this point. But we start to see that a lot of banks get in trouble. So let's take a quick random aside. This is what we see for banks. For banks, here's the asset side of the bank's balance sheet. Here's the liability side. Here are bank deposits. And here's the bank's equity. Here's the bank's own value. On the asset side, there are a few different things that make up assets from the perspective of banks. But we'll mostly say the assets are home mortgages. So we have the asset side of the bank's balance sheet, mostly home mortgages. We have the liability side of the bank's balance sheet, which is mostly the deposits that the bank has. And then we have the bank's own value, the bank's own wealth, equity. And this equity portion is called the bank's capital cushion. So we start to see a housing crisis emerge in parts of the country. Again, it's partly because of this recession. There are other factors that contribute as well. But we see a lot of people losing their homes. Recession is on the way. A recession is in place. A lot of people are losing their homes. When someone defaults on their mortgage, right, when you can't pay your mortgage, then, originally it's the mortgage that is present on the asset side of the bank's balance sheet. But if someone defaults, then the home itself becomes present on the asset side of the balance sheet. Of course, that's how a mortgage works, right? If you don't pay your mortgage, then the bank just takes the house, and the house itself becomes there as an asset. But if a lot of people are defaulting, if banks are seeing many houses show up here on their balance sheets, and banks are trying to go back to the market and sell these houses, what's happening to housing prices? If everybody can't pay their mortgage payments, if the banks are taking over the houses, if the banks are trying to sell the houses, flooding the market with houses, it's driving down housing prices. So we start to see this asset deterioration, right? We start to see this asset deterioration, right? These assets are just shrinking in value, right? As these housing prices go down, the asset side of the bank's balance sheet just shrinks. And so we have this point right here, right? This is the capital cushion, as I said. The assets can shrink down to this point, and the banks will still be solvent, because shrinkage on the assets is just met by a reduction in the bank's own value, the bank's equity. But once assets deteriorate past this point, then you have a situation where the bank's liabilities, the deposits that it owes people, where the deposits are more than the value that the bank has. When assets shrink past this point, the bank becomes insolvent. The amount of money that the bank owes people, depositors, exceeds the value that the bank has. When the bank becomes insolvent, absent any type of insurance or any type of federal protection, then people who have money in the bank, they just lose their money. Their money's gone. At least part of their money's gone. It depends on how much the assets shrink in value. This started happening for some banks, and people started just losing their money in banks. And like a lot of people didn't know, like, is this going to happen to my bank, or is my bank going to be okay? And they didn't know. Some banks were just fine, but people didn't know they were fine. So we started to see bank runs, bank panics. Everybody just started to go to the bank to withdraw their money, to get their money out quickly before this situation happened to their bank. Widespread bank runs across the country. When this happens, this is a financial crisis. When this happens, the banks just shut down. I mean, the flow of financial capital just stops in the economy. Long story short, the Federal Reserve was around. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, so the Fed had been around for about 20 years when this happened. The Fed should have intervened to provide support, to keep the flow of financial capital happening, to keep the economy opening. But the Fed looked at this very differently. The Fed, hindsight's 2020. It's easy for us to say the Fed was totally stupid and dumb. They were, but it's easy for us to say that. But at the time, people thought about the economy very differently. So the Fed did not intervene to keep banks open, to support banks, to maintain the flow of financial capital. The Fed actually made things worse. Anyway, so what happened was a financial crisis emerged. The flow of financial capital fell dramatically, and interest rates rose dramatically. All of this came in to put much, 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 much more downward pressure on aggregate demand, getting us down here to aggregate demand 4, getting us down here to point D, getting us down here to Y4. Okay? This was a recession. It was a bad recession to begin with. And the financial crisis and the fact that the Fed made it worse, not better, that changed it from a bad recession to the Great Depression. Ultimately, output fell. Output fell by about 30%. And the price level actually fell by about 25 or 30% as well. Okay? I mean, output fell by an unprecedented level, absolutely unprecedented level, once this shifted from a bad recession to the Great Depression. Okay, but this is where macroeconomics started as a discipline, right? This depression was so bad, and unemployment jumped up to 25%, by the way. This is showing output, but unemployment is also embedded within this axis. Even though we're not showing it, unemployment moves closely with GDP, so unemployment correspondingly reached 25%. But this was so bad that this was a big enough deal to shift the focus of economists away from those long-run fundamentals over to short-run fluctuations in the economy. That's how bad this was. This is your classic example of a demand-driven recession. In this case, depression, but whatever. It's a classic example of a situation in which aggregate demand falls due to, in this case, various reasons that just built on each other, and it led to a situation where GDP is falling dramatically, the price level's falling, and unemployment's rising correspondingly. Your classic demand-driven recession. The second example we'll go through here. Here's Y. Here's the price level. Aggregate demand 1. Aggregate supply, Y1. And we'll just assume as well as we did before that we're starting at the natural rate. Here, the example we're going to use is the late 60s boom. Late 60s boom. Start out here at point A. In the late 60s, we have a bunch of stuff going on in the economy. First off, we have Vietnam. Vietnam, big increases in government spending, right? We really accelerated Vietnam about 1967, 1968. I mean, we'd been involved in Vietnam for a long time before, but it had been a more mild level of involvement, at least in terms of the numbers of people, amount of spending, et cetera. But in the late 60s, Vietnam was accelerated greatly. That means big increases in government spending. We also have the kind of the cornerstone of the Johnson administration domestically was called the Great Society. Great Society was like Johnson's catchphrase for what he was doing with the country domestically. The Great Society reflects big increases in government spending domestically. This is when Medicare and Medicaid came about. We have big increases in unemployment insurance. We have big increases in various forms of welfare. Vietnam and Great Society both reflect big increases in government spending. Great Society domestically, Vietnam obviously a foreign issue, but it still involved domestic spending, which would affect the domestic economy. And then we also have the Fed lowers interest rates. The Fed lowers interest rates. We're going to talk in a couple chapters about why the Fed did that, but for now, just take it as a given. All these things work to boost aggregate demand, right? Big increases in aggregate demand. We get from point A to point B, and we have very high levels of GDP. We get up here to Y2, very rapid GDP growth. This was a huge time for output growth in the economy. Correspondingly, we have unemployment of less than 4%, very low unemployment. We had negative cyclical unemployment as a result. And over here on this axis, we're starting to see big increases in the price level. We're starting to see big jumps in inflation. Okay? So I hope what you see here in these two examples is the classic business cycle. Up here, what do we have? We have a recession with low GDP. You know, that's how the recession is defined, but it also carries with it high unemployment and low inflation. The price level has actually fallen in this case. So in this case, it's even negative inflation. Okay, but this is your classic trough of the business cycle, or your classic recession, characterized by high unemployment and low inflation. In this example, we have the classic peak of the business cycle: rapid GDP growth, low unemployment, high inflation. These two examples give you your business cycle. And we talked about the business cycle back in the GDP chapter. Now we're talking about where the business cycle comes from. If I come up to you and if I say, where does the business cycle come from? The answer is the business cycle comes from movements in aggregate demand around a fixed aggregate supply curve. That's where your classic business cycle comes from, and this is what usually happens. In a second, we're going to talk about movements in aggregate supply, but that's much less common. Movements in aggregate demand are far more common in the economy, so that's why we get the very common pattern that we term the business cycle, you know, from that kind of movement, from demand movements. Okay? So those are your two classic examples, and those are old examples, but we use those examples over and over again because they really illustrate the fundamentals. The next example Next example is the OPEC oil embargo. OPEC oil embargo occurred around 72, 73. The OPEC oil embargo. This is a classic example of a supply shock. We have to go back to 72, 73 to get this story because there are very, very few examples of supply shocks, at least major supply shocks that have big effects that are kind of worth remembering. You might see like very short-term movements in aggregate supply, like there was a movement in 2008 that was very small in aggregate supply, but it wasn't a big deal. Very few movements in aggregate supply, but anyway, this example, OPEC oil embargo. So here we're talking about the OPEC countries, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They get together at this time and they decide they're going to, form a cartel. They're going to act collectively in such a way that they restrict the output of oil, right? These are major oil exporting countries, countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Iran and Nigeria and Venezuela. Some of those countries that are big oil producers sell a lot of oil on the world market. They're certainly not the only oil producers in the world, but they, at the very least at the time, they had enough of the market that they could greatly influence world prices. Anyway, they come together. They had been operating kind of in a competitive environment. They come together and decide that they're going to act collectively, restrict output, drive up the price, and they'll make more money. They'll act more like a monopoly. So they're successful, at least for a while. They are successful at restricting output and driving up price significantly. You have to think about this. We're talking about the price of oil. But the price of oil, that's not just a normal good. I mean, it's not just a typical good. The price of oil goes into the production of everything. Right? We're talking about energy, right? The price of, oil is directly an input into many products, right? Plastics, right? Oil goes directly into plastics. But just transportation, right? Everything, every good that you buy is transported. So oil is an input into the production of anything because anything's transported. If the price of oil goes up, price of gas goes up, price of everything goes up. So when OPEC was successful in forming this collusive agreement, price of oil goes up, people expected the price of everything to go up, and it reflected a supply shock in the economy. It drove down supply in this kind of very short-term sense because it happened so quickly. We moved from point A to point B. And this is a weird situation because here we have a drop in output where output's falling. We're in a recession, right? This was a pretty bad recession, 72, 73. We're in a recession, unemployment is rising, right? Anytime output's falling, unemployment's rising. Unemployment and GDP move together very closely on this axis, right? Unemployment's linked closely with GDP. But over here on the vertical axis, we have the price level rising. We have inflation. So normally when we see a recession, we see low inflation, as in the Great Depression example. When we see a boom, we see high inflation, as in the late 60s example. Those two examples are both, classic. But here we have this weird situation where we have a recession, but with it, we have high inflation as well. Very, very bad situation because kind of both bad things are happening at once. And, rare situation. This is called stagflation. Stagflation. This is kind of the term that's just used to attach to this situation. The economy's stagnant. The economy's falling, but you can say that it's stagnant if you want to. The economy's stagnant, but it's coupled with inflation. So thus the term stagflation. A recession which of course has high unemployment, but it's also coupled with high inflation. Fortunately, this type of scenario is not very common. And then the last example we'll go through, you guessed it. Last example is the late 90s. Start off here at Y1. In the late 90s, boy, it was a weird economy. The economy was booming because of technological progress. We talked about this before. We talked about it in the context of the stock bubble that emerged in the 1990s. But this story can also be manifest here in the agri-demand to agri-supply framework. We have, the full integration of personal computers into business, which is greatly enhancing productivity. And we have the internet that's coming online that's really rapidly changing the way we do things. And of course, now the world is completely different because of the internet. So this is an example of a positive supply shock. Positive supply shock moving from A to B. We have a booming economy, right? Output is rising rapidly. Up here from Y1 to Y2, output rising rapidly, doing very well on that front. And then we also have unemployment of less than 4%. As I said before, in the late 60s, this is another one of those very rare examples where unemployment comes in at less than 4%. And we have very low inflation. Now, this model is a static model. This model does not have all the nuance that we would like to have. You can make it have more nuance, but it makes it more complicated and it's not worth the extra complexity for this class. But this shows a falling price level, but the price level wasn't actually falling. We didn't have negative inflation or deflation, but anyway, we had very low inflation. So just look over the lack of nuance in this model. But a booming economy, very low unemployment, and very low inflation, right? A booming economy and low unemployment is normally associated with high inflation, as in the late 60s. But here we have very low inflation. Okay? This example, of course, is very near and dear to my heart because this is when I was in college. So when I was first learning economics, this is what was going on. And I remember the professor, I remember it very vividly. The professor talking about how unusual this economy is. The economy that we're seeing is very, very unusual with incredibly, incredibly low unemployment and incredibly low inflation. Okay? That's the 4 examples. Those 4 examples show you basically all 4 possibilities, right? Your possibilities are you have a demand-driven boom, you have a demand-driven recession, which are both common. Demand-driven recession is most common, but demand-driven boom is common as well. And then you have a supply-driven recession and a supply-driven boom. That's your 4 options. Those are, you can use that model, and I guarantee, look at any recession that you've seen since the end of World War II, and you can make sense out of any recession with those 4 models, with those 4 examples, with the one model, but it's going to be similar to one of those 4 examples. In the discussion, we'll talk about the recession we have right now and how it fits into that model. We can talk about the early 90s recession. We can talk about the early 2000s recession. We can talk about the 2008, 2009 recession. All those recessions can be easily explained in that context. Okay? Now, from the short run to the long run. Okay, I'm going to draw another picture, the picture I've shown before, where we just depict GDP over time. So here's our aggregate demand supply model. We're starting out at point A, and we're assuming that point A is on the natural rate. We assume that point A is on the long run equilibrium. Now over here, I'm just depicting the movements in GDP over time. You know, here we have a recession, here we have a boom, we're trucking along, and the economy's, you know, normal. The economy's where it's supposed to be at point A in this figure. Okay? These two, you know, we're just looking at two different figures, right? This is an actual analytic, right? On this side, this is an actual analytical model. Here, I'm just depicting GDP and how it moves over time just to show a point. Right? This isn't a model. This is just showing GDP in a graph. But suppose some shock happens. It can be animal spirits. It can be whatever. Aggregate demand falls to 82. We move from point A down like this to point B. We move into a recession. Over here, we move to point B. The economy moves into a recession, right? Anything, there's 100 different things that could cause aggregate demand to fall. We talked about animal spirits. We talked about how aggregate demand is pretty volatile, right? Aggregate demand actually isn't as volatile, I don't think, as it used to be. I think the economy has become more stable over time, but we still have movements in aggregate demand, and this is a good example of that. Or this is an illustration of how that happens. You can come up with any examples to plug in. Okay? So this is the thing. This is how it works. The recession happened when I mean the drop in demand happened. That thrust the economy into a disequilibrium, and to reach a new equilibrium, the price level fell. Right, the price level fell from this point to this point. Okay, had some shock to the economy, and the price level, and I think it's safe for us to say the price level fell unexpectedly. The very nature of these aggregate demand fluctuations, when we're talking about animal spirits, they're unexpected. At least if they're expected, then that would be a totally different story, and we'd be analyzing it differently. We'll come back later and talk about that. But we have an unexpected shock. The price level falls unexpectedly, and the reason firms cut their output is because of sticky wages, sticky prices, misperceptions. Those theories that we talked about in the last video, that's why aggregate demand, that's why aggregate supply slopes upward. It's those wage and price rigidities and those misperceptions, that's what caused output to fall. That's why the aggregate supply curve looks the way that it does. Right? The economy's off balance because the economy can't adjust because of wage and price rigidities and misperceptions. But the key is, over time, people will adjust to this lower price level. Those wage contracts, those price contracts, those perceptions will all adjust to catch up with the prices. When that happens, the way we express it in this model is we say that over time, the economy adjusts to a lower expected price level. And as that happens, aggregate supply increases, and the economy moves back in this pattern back to point C. The economy falls into a recession. We're in a recession because after the shock happens, we're in a recession because wage and price rigidities and misperceptions do not allow the economy to adjust to the shock. That's why we're off balance, because we can't adjust. But over time, as we do adjust, that adjustment is reflected in an increase in the aggregate supply curve. That brings the economy back to point C. that brings the economy back to the natural rate. In this graph, we just bounce back. We come back to point C, and then we keep moving along. So the economy fixes itself in the long run. The economy fixes itself. There's these creatures called weebles. Weebles. Google that. Pause the video and go Google that. The little creatures, as you saw when you paused the video, they look like this. They have a round bottom, and then it's like, you know, kind of like a character coming out. Here's a hand, blah, blah, blah. Here's a face. Weebles look like that. This is like a little character here. They have the round bottom. And if you push on the weeble, right, if you push on it, then it bounces a little while, but it comes back up on its own. You can use those weebles to kind of characterize the way the economy works. Okay? This drop in aggregate demand, right, is this shock, right? This animal spirit, this shock is a force that pushes on the weeble, and it causes it to fall on the side. Right? When it falls on the side, then it's in a recession. That's the recession. But the weeble, due to its very nature, it bounces back and it comes back on its own. And we just talked about the mechanism through which that happens. Okay? And you see over here, on this side of the picture, you see the economy goes from A to B, it falls into a recession, but over time, as the economy adjusts to a lower price level, as wage and prices adjust, as wage and price contracts adjust, I mean to say, and as perceptions adjust, the economy bounces back to C, the economy fixes itself in the long run. Okay? That's a really important point. This issue about how the macroeconomic system fixes itself is key. Make sure that you have time to digest that and understand that, because that's one of the most important points that we cover. All right, that's it for chapter 33. Talk to you soon.